good to see you. I can see some thumbnails and know that we're all here on Zoom. So thanks to Claire, to Sarah, the Cambridge Network for facilitating these discussions. And we are in the midst of a public health crisis, and for today, I thought if we could just be real. These are unprecedented times, quite tricky for a lot of us. We suddenly had to start working from home. I fortunately have a well set up office from home, but how many of us have actually had to recruit via video only and not have that face-to-face interaction? And these are the issues that I will be talking about today. Now, Claire and I throughout will be answering some questions, so keep the chat coming, and she will be looking at that for me because I've got an awful lot going on my screen. When Claire got hold of me, what was it, about 3 weeks ago? The first thing she said was, I think it was about 3 weeks ago, you asked me if I could share some of my experiences and thoughts about recruiting remotely. And the first thing I said, well, was, is anybody recruiting? Because this was just before the shutdown. And then I was thinking, what is on top of everyone's mind? And a client that I'm currently mentoring said to me, well, I'm in this situation where we're going full steam ahead. I've got to build a team of 20 people, but I'm used to doing a telephone interview and then following it up with a face-to-face. And how will I know that I'm hiring the right people who I can then look in the face when we so-called back to normal? And how will they all get on? Very valid question. I've been put in the same situation because I sit on an independent panel for the Judicial Appointments Commission. And in a couple of weeks, instead of being in London and sitting with my 2 panel members, we are going to be interviewing 3 senior judges over Zoom. And that's going to be interesting because by the end of the day, we are going to have to make a hiring recommendation to the Lord Chancellor. So no matter what type of recruiting you're doing or I'm doing, the stakes are high and we have to get it right. And that's where I thought it's such a massive topic that I'd like to break it up into 3 sessions. And the first today is very much focusing on us as recruiters. Now, the first question I'd like to ask you, I'd be very interested in your thoughts on the chat, is have you been recruiting remotely for any length of time? And what difference does the remote recruiting make as opposed to being face-to-face? Claire, have we got some questions?
I think we've got some coming through shortly.
So what's it like for you? What difference does it make when you're recruiting remotely?
Yeah, so Lewis, yeah, I thought that this was the process. They have recruited remotely at Display Link. Yeah, so all remote now. So I know they have a lot of overseas hires. Is anyone else at the moment, or are they? Okay. Right. Laura, making real connections. Are you still? Okay. So yeah, there's a few coming through saying that they've recruited remotely. It's all been well received. Not recruiting remotely yet. Wondering if it's something we can do and how. So looking forward to the session with some tips. Yes, also from Ulrich. Hi Ulrich. Also saves some travel to Europe. And no, people aren't recruiting. So yeah, hopefully you can get some tips and share. So Lewis and a couple of people have said, yeah, it does take longer. You have to double the meeting and interview time, so time consuming. Diana, hi Diana. She's done some recruiting remotely in the past for roles in other locations. So
Wonderful, that's good to know. So we've got Lewis, who's quite familiar with it. Ulrich's done a little bit. Some of you, Sharon, I think, is also saying you've done some recruiting, but for most of us, I think it's something we're not used to doing constantly. And I hope that today I will be able to share some research with you, as well as some tips and what I'm calling antidotes to help you make the most of the situation.
Yeah, perfect. I think some of the questions are around why it takes longer. What difference does it make to recruit remotely? And I think it's the prep, really, and it's getting everyone on board and having to do that with your own team remotely initially, as well as the person that you're meeting virtually. So all of that takes a lot more prep time, I think.
And yet maybe that's a great opportunity, because perhaps we're forced to do more thinking and more prep, be more considered about what we need and how we're going to get that information. So perhaps in a good way, this is going to make us better recruiters.
Okay.
Now I'd like to look at the first issue that I often hear. A lot of people say to me that remote recruiting is absolutely fine. They have experienced no difference to recruiting in person. And Lewis, you happen to be on my screen and I can see you shaking your head. That is a myth, because there is a very big difference between being in the same room and reading those nonverbal signals. And I did some research that I'm going to share with you today, and in the resource that you're going to receive from Claire, by Nick Morgan, who's written a book called Can You Hear Me? How to Connect with People in a Virtual World. And if we consider before an interview, we will have several email conversations with a candidate. Now, we believe that 90% of the time, any texts we send or emails are understood. But in reality, and you can type this into the chat box, what percentage of time are we understood on email and text, do you think? What is the actual percentage of time? I can see a few there, Claire, coming through. 30%.
Yeah, 30.
Oh, Laura, 50%, 60%, 50%. Yes, absolutely. Only 50% of the time are we actually understood. And I've sent this email, maybe you have, where you'll send it to someone and say, great job. Well, 60% of the time, people think you're being sarcastic. So there's an awful lot that gets misunderstood in our email and text communication. And then we had this amazing technological advent called frictionless communication. Now, for those of you who don't really know what that means, frictionless is when we've got synchronous and asynchronous data being exchanged. So synchronous is when it's one lot of information at a time, but asynchronous allows for multiple bits of data to be exchanged. You don't have to actually finish one thing before you execute another. For example, I could send an email inviting someone to an interview in the evening, and they can respond to me the next morning. That would be asynchronous. But how frictionless is it? Because with this frictionless communication, we've learned to skim read. We open our emails in the morning and we see this huge inbox, so we just skim read. And that's where, on average, we're only picking up 50% of what is actually meant and intended, and we miss things. I know I've done it. I've gone to the wrong building for a meeting. I'm sure you've had candidates who haven't turned up, but The first time yesterday, I actually heard of someone who had gate crashed a Zoom interview because they'd been sent the wrong link.
Oh dear.
Not good. Now, no matter how advanced, it's wonderful. We can all sit in our homes and look at each other on the screen, but we are actually in a sensory deprivation chamber because we're not getting those non-verbal signals. I'm going to just switch off my video for a moment and tell you that I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy to be here. Can you see the difference? Just by listening to my voice, you didn't pick up that I had my arms folded and I was actually frowning. So when we have a choice between comparing the content of what someone is saying versus the body language trumps every time. Because we care more about the intention or the intent in the communication, not the precise words. And this is where the irony comes, because the more connected we are virtually, the more we lack. Sorry, I think I did a little glitch there. I've just gone back and realized what I should be doing. Because we're lacking human sensory feedback, it can lead to misunderstandings, and we're deprived of that emotional knowledge, as I was saying, because we don't necessarily have the context. We don't have, obviously, smells, and it's amazing how much we do take in about someone through smell. We might think, oh gosh, they had lots of garlic last night, or nice perfume, or whatever. Touch, we do have some hearing, we have some seeing, but we certainly don't have any tastes. And our brains are this multi-channel analysis machine. So in a face-to-face world, we are 24/7 unconsciously taking in all of this data around us, and it makes us alert and aware to the dangers around us. So what happens when we haven't got it? We actually start to make things up because our brains fill in the gaps. We make things up based on memories we have, a hint of something, an anxiety that we may have. And we logically, our brains think the worst. So if I've sent you an email and I haven't heard back from you straight away, I'm assuming something's happened. Or it makes me realize, having done this research through Nick Morgan, just why candidates are despondent, despair when they don't hear back from us. They've sent a CV they've spent hours on, they haven't heard back. You said you would call them at a certain time, they haven't heard back. And now they think, that's it, it's over. So when we take the emotion out of our virtual communications, it can lead to bad decision making. And I think that's the thing for us as recruiters to be really aware of. We think we make decisions logically, but we don't. We make decisions based on memories. Now I'm going to move on to that next slide and ask you, because you've all got quite a lot of experience in recruiting, and you know, how much of our communication are you finding you're not able to pick up, that you're aware of now that you're starting to recruit remotely? Are there any blockers that you're finding?
Yeah, I think I know that we're going to go on to this, in a moment, Catherine, but there were a couple of questions around unconscious bias for the risk of bad decisions, which we're going to cover off. So yeah, and I think initial telephone call for that reason helps remove bias. I think we spoke about this yesterday, and it's kind of just making sure that you're communicating across all of the communication platforms available, so that you're getting a touch base with that candidate across all of those channels, so video, phone and email.
Yes.
Laura, investing in a good quality webcam, yeah, and good Wi-Fi, as I've experienced as well, because yeah, I think technology lets you down and you can't come across in the best light. So I think those things are good tips.
Thank you. That's really good. Some of the practicalities of Wi-Fi, and you can't always help it. I think I'm finding my Wi-Fi has dropped up. I've got really good Wi-Fi, but because so many people are working from home, it has dropped out occasionally.
Yeah.
So yes. And bias. Is there anything else, Claire, before we move on?
Yeah, just as well, blockers. This is a really good point. So the more technical collaboration with a candidate is harder to do, but possible in planning and testing before interviews. So going back to what we said initially, just making sure you've prepped and have a candidate doing a presentation. So this example, this recruiter has a candidate doing a presentation to the execs later today. So making sure that those candidates are prepped as well. Sharing screens when collaborating on something together as well. It's a good tip.
Yes, those are all really good. So thank you for sharing those, because I think it helps all of us to just think of how we can overcome it together, really. And it brings me to my first antidote or solution, and the one that we're using right now, most of us, and that is, wherever possible, try and use video. Yes, we can have telephone screening interviews, but for your first or second interview, use video. It's certainly the best virtual channel because we get some sense of how a candidate is responding. However, to make up for, now that we know how our brains are wired, to make up for this lack of sensory deprivation, I think we need to really start using language consciously and very deliberately, and thinking about how they're feeling and responding. And this helps us build trust and connection. If I was in a face-to-face situation going to meet a candidate, I'd probably go to reception. And if I noticed that they had their arms folded or their hands together, that closed in look, immediately my brain would be saying they're feeling uncomfortable, they're nervous. And I would be trying to do things to make them feel much more comfortable. I'd probably talk about the weather and if they found parking and all of that chit chat that just helps people relax. Now we've got someone sitting, all looking very, fine, and the door's closed. How can we do that? By using language and being consciously aware of how to make them feel more relaxed. And the one thing might be to literally say, normally we would be meeting face to face. We're in our home offices, but please make yourself at home, and then perhaps pick up, if you've got a glass of water or a cup of coffee, take a sip, sit back. Then you might lean forward at times, look into the camera, remember to smile, because smiling is another thing that's saying it's okay, it's safe. And all of these will show that you relaxed and will help them to relax.
Absolutely. Some really good points as well coming through that, agreeing with are, I think, more than ever now, because it is a video connection rather than a face-to-face engagement, that you communicate all the way through the process. So more communication, checking that they understand everything that you're saying and you're going over, because they, once the video goes and they switch off into their real life again, that engagement gone completely. So making sure that they're more signposting what they're doing first and next, checking they understand.
Yes. Oh, that's great. I like that about signposting and, or I call calling it out.
Well, this is good. So yeah, one comment that they've heard that seeing someone with a cup of tea or coffee creates more trust than no drink or glass.
Yes. And then there I was, I know Sarah. Oh, there you are, Lewis. I love tea. You're in my team.
It is good.
I'm out of tea. Can anyone go make me some? So thank you for that. The other thing that we're doing, in fact, because Claire is my chair or MC, is all try and have a chair. And anyway, I'm a huge advocate of never interviewing alone. And I'd always say, have other people interviewing alongside you, because if you have a chair, it may seem more formal, but there's a massive payoff later on. And I'll go into this a little bit more about why I'm a huge advocate of having panel interviews rather than just one-to-one interviews. The chair can monitor participation and ensure you're not talking over one another. And also, you might be able to then hand over and say, for example, I could say to perhaps Claire, over to you for your question on team working, or Laura, is there anything you might like to add? So being a little bit more formal. Also being more tolerant. I think we've had some comments about if the dog is barking. Somebody might start to see that they're getting distracted if you're interviewing them. And they might have a young child wailing in the background. Perhaps you could say, you seem to be a little bit distracted. Would you like a quick break? Because we're all cooped up, we're all in the same position. I don't know if any of you ever saw the video that went viral of, I think it's Dr. Robert Kelly. He was being interviewed on the BBC, and he's an expert in South Korean politics. And he had set up his own home office, was perfect. He had a map on the wall behind him. He was in a suit and tie, and mid-interview, the door opens and his little toddler comes running in. And he just freezes, and he's doing this with his hand, trying to get it to move away, when his other little boy comes in and his walking chair comes whizzing in. And then you see eventually his wife almost crawling in, trying not to be seen and grabbing them. Now, in this day and age, when we're all interviewing and we're all at home, the best solution might have been if he had actually just picked one of them up and dangled them on his knee, and or just said, excuse me, God called his wife and take them out, but the next time he'll probably lock his door. He won't ever go there again. So these distractions do happen. So recruiting via video is great, but make sure that your communication is intentional rather than relying on those non-verbal signals. Are there any other tips or anything going on in the chat, Claire, that you'd like to bring up at this point?
I think we're all just reminiscing about that video clip.
Oh, really?
You just spoke about, but yeah. So yeah, comment, Lewis uses active listening a lot.
Yes.
Yes.
Lewis, I think that's brilliant comment, Lewis. You've anticipating my next tip. Shall I move on?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah.
That's exactly it, is we need to really ramp up our listening levels to make up for, in many ways, all of the visual overstimulation we're having. Just as I'm sitting and looking at you, when I focus on the camera, which is up there, I've actually got two screens. So I've got screen with the presentation over there, I've got some notes over there, I've got chat when I look at it. I've got all sorts going on. I've got to remember to use my mouse to move the slides because my screen wasn't responding. Now, if I'm busy fiddling with all of that, I'm not listening to what a candidate is saying. And so often, and I'm sure we've all done it in an interview, you nodding, you sort of surface listening, and meantime you're really thinking of the next question. Or you might, in a virtual situation, quickly be typing a private message and saying, are you going to be asking the next question? Now, my dad in South Africa is a past master at surface listening. And I called him last night. He's 89, and he doesn't even pretend. He's almost, I can hear, yeah. And the minute I pause for breath, he's in. And I can tell that he's not heard me or listened because he asks me something completely opposite to what I've been talking about. So surface listening is a real issue. For my tips on how to listen more closely and to really ramp it up, I'd like you to either close your eyes or switch off your video, because that's what I'm going to be doing, so that you can now hear my voice and practice listening more deeply. What we need to be doing is issues-based listening. And this is where we cut through what's being said and focus on what really matters. What's the underlying message and the implications of what is being said? Because if we can focus on what those key issues are and listen for them, we can then start to ask some probing, open questions, such as, so what do you mean by that? How did this play out? Can you tell me more? Now, once we know what the actual issues are, we need to go even deeper. And this is what I call emotions-based listening. This is the true agenda, the underlying emotion and motivation behind the issue. And to pick up on the emotion, we need to pay particular attention to the tone of voice. Are they going into emotion and then coming out of it? Or are they staying in emotion, sounding upset, sounding concerned? And when we spot it, then we can acknowledge it. You could say something like, it sounds like your CEO's reaction to your report upset you. I've now put my video back on. And I'd be really interested in how you found that. What was it like for you to be thinking about those deeper levels of listening and not worrying about what's going on visually? Please feel free to put your comments in the chat.
I think, yeah, I agree as well. Better listening with less distractions. So I'm thinking, Katherine, if you did have a few people on the interview at a time, maybe one person can stay with the camera on and catch those body language signs, and the other person maybe turn the visual off and can concentrate on that deeper listening.
That's quite interesting, Claire.
Would that work?
Well, if you think about it, we're forming a connection with people, and if we were all in the same room, you wouldn't suddenly disappear.
True.
However, I think what you might say, you could set that up at the beginning and say, we want to listen very closely to what you've been saying. So you have an option. You can either look at the top of my head because I'm going to be sitting writing notes or typing notes because I want to capture everything. Or what we've agreed in this interview is that when so-and-so is asking the question, we will have our cameras off so that you can focus on just one person because we think that might be helpful. What is your preference? Maybe because I'm thinking also this is about the other person as well. I think what we need to do is just be really good at practicing and learning to listen without letting on that that's what we're doing, and listen for those deeper levels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point from Kelly. Thanks, Kelly. So there's a balance between the relationship building online and the information gathering for interview purposes. So with no video, it's harder to relationship build. Fine. Yeah. So that answers my question in terms of the video versus the visual and the deeper listening.
Thank you. That's a good comment. Thanks, Kelly. And I think to do the listening bit really well as when we're remote recruiting is we need to be very present. We need to also be objective, open, and curious. My third recommendation, and this comes back to Ulrich, I think earlier it pointed out, the importance of overcoming our biases. Now, so much has been written about and talked about unconscious bias. I thought it'd be useful just to recap for those of you who familiar with it, or maybe not so familiar with it. But really, our unconscious bias is when we're having a preconception about something, and we all do it all the time, no matter how open-minded and impartial we are. So we're making assumptions about people and situations without realizing it, and these can be both positive and they can be negative. In fact, I practice it all the time. When I'm sitting at an airport, I people watch, and my biggest game, it takes hours, it keeps me entertained, is I'm imagining, are they in a relationship with that person? Are they a country bumpkin? Are they a city slicker? What kind of job they do? But, and this is the big but, is how accurate am I? And if we remember about what's going on up in our brains, is when we're encountering a new person or a new situation, we're having to process a huge amount of cognitive information, up to about 11 million pieces of information at any one time. And we can only consciously deal with very small amounts. In fact, we can consciously recognize about 40 pieces of information and focus on about 5 to 7 at any one time, which is why I'm, as I said earlier, deliberately decided to not focus on the chat so that I could be focusing on the other things. Now, when we can't cope with this information overload, we move to unconscious categorizing of information. And when we categorize and filter, we tend to be looking for what's familiar, what's similar to what we already know. And when this isn't helpful is when we see somebody, or we perhaps read a CV, and it sets off something that we have a memory about and will trigger an unconscious bias. Now, we start very young. According to Michael Page, they did some research on 7 to 11-year-olds, and they'd already made some gender-based assumptions on different professions. 65% of them drew a lawyer as a male. 80% of them, they drew a builder as a male, and 81% of them drew a nurse as a female. Now, understanding that we all doing this means that it will have some potentially very negative implications when we are recruiting and interviewing. So what to do, and these are some of the things that I do a lot of the time and thought they might be helpful for you. Whenever I start screening a CV, conduct a telephone interview or preparing for a face-to-face interview, I just take a moment, take a deep breath, and I actually tell myself, be fair, be objective. And by doing that, I'm mitigating the risk of being biased by about 50% already. Recognizing that we all have it, and not something to be ashamed of, but to actually talk about it openly. And this is where earlier I've been saying to you about having a panel or having other people to interview with. Get them to challenge you. Or you can also challenge them. But say, well, why did you think that? I mean, that's happened to me in many interviews where I've perhaps heard and listened and seen and thought someone was absolutely fantastic because they've made a good first impression. And one of the male chairs that I was sitting with said, but she didn't answer this question, that question. And I became quite defensive at first. And then I thought he was right. I'd been so taken in by that, you know, her lovely voice, she was well dressed, she seemed confident, that I didn't realize that she was skimming over some of the answers. And it really helped me. So do that and ask for help. Ask for people to challenge you. Mm-hmm. The other thing is to manage your environment. Is if you're having a very busy time and you're trying to pack in too many interviews in a day, you're under time pressure, you're tired. When our brains are overloaded, we rely a lot more on our overall impressions and our gut instinct than we normally would. And the final antidote here is to remember that if people come from different backgrounds and experiences, they may have a way of demonstrating their achievements. That's not how we would do it. So take the time, probe their responses, draw them out, and don't assume that just because they're not putting across their achievements as we would, that they're not good at what they do. Claire, in the corner of my eye, I did see the chat was going, and I wondered if there had been any comments there.
No, we've got some great sharing, so fantastic. Thanks, everyone. Just some sharing there. I just wanted to come to a question that Ulrich asked earlier, Katherine, in relation to unconscious bias. So his question was, do you see the reduction of senses more as an opportunity for reduction of unconscious bias or a risk for bad decision making?
If I was to think about that, I think it's not a reduction in a way, because suddenly we have, well, for me personally, I've got fewer sensory things going on, but I'm more than in my own mindset potentially. And I feel I'm with you all, but actually I'm sitting alone, and I've got my things that are familiar to me and my unconscious biases and how I would do things going on quite separately. So I don't think there would be a reduction of unconscious bias. It's something to always be aware of and mitigate against. I don't know what everyone else thinks about that.
No, no comments about that specifically. Maybe you just need to think on that point, Katherine. I think we can move on.
Thank you. So today I've given you 3 tips, and you might think it's really easy now, hopefully, much easier to recruit remotely. Just remember, number 1, use video because it helps negate that sensory deprivation. 2, to listen much more deeply than usual. And 3, avoid unconscious bias, or you will be at the risk of making a poor or a bad hiring decision. Just to let you know, and I think we will have a bit of time, Claire, before further questions and discussions, is if there's anything that you'd particularly like to bring up that we haven't had time to cover today, the next webinar on interviewing by video on the 29th of April is going to be more about the actual interview, the practical housekeeping, to know what you're looking for and how to get the information you need. And then the onboarding via video on the 6th of May will be about boundaries, motivation, how to understand what motivates candidates and people that you've now hired, and also a little bit more about culture and your leadership skills and how you bring all that together. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyone like any further comments to make, questions to ask?
Yeah, yes, Judy, those webinars are through Cambridge Network, so they're already on our events. I think to summarise really, and what I'm seeing coming through is just prep, lots of prep, making sure that, Philip, that's a really good point. So giving candidates some tips about how to cope with online interviewing. We're going to be covering that as well with Sharon, who I believe is on here from Cameo Recruitment. We're going to be running some candidate focused webinars just on how to react as a candidate in the situation as well. So yeah, I think both parties, both the interviewee and the interviewer, just need to be fully versed on how to react in this new way of recruiting. Make sure you're researching. We've had some really good shares of some information on the chat as well, so I'll make sure all of that goes out in case anyone's missed it as well. So just prep.
Yes, prep is great. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's really good. And it's good to know that you're also offering the support to candidates, because it's a new, well, not that new. I think a lot of candidates have been doing some interviews, but the more prep you can give them, the more trust you build as well. Absolutely. As a company. It's really good for your brand.
Absolutely. Wonderful. So that's really good, really helpful. Thank you so much, Catherine. Just for anyone online as well that's interested, we're going to have a bash, an online jobs fair on May the 14th. We were going to be at Eddington, but obviously that's not going to happen. So if anyone wants any further details, please get in touch. We've got some companies on board at the moment. It's going to be a setup similar to this with candidates invited, and the company can do an elevator pitch to that room, and then we'll help you with the shortlisting screening of candidates after. And it's all free of charge, obviously, at the moment. We just want to keep candidates and companies connected. So wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Thank you so much, Catherine. That was really informative. Okay.
Great. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Take care all. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you, everybody.